Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to this seminar by GRIP in collaboration with the Center for Care Research West, HVL. I'm happy to welcome every one of you, our participants in the panel, to discuss this very important theme of crisis in care in the Nordics. First, I will give a short presentation of the theme and then of the participants, and each participant will contribute with a paper of 15 minutes each. And then after that, we will open for questions, comments, and discussions. So, care is an existential for humans. Care is relational, social, and intrinsically tied to human interdependency. Care is also embedded in specific socio-historical, cultural, and institutional arrangements. Thus, care is political. Care is also work, formal and informal, paid and unpaid, recognized and unrecognized by various social orders. As paid work, care is commodified, politicized, and categorized as labor. And in the Nordic welfare state context, both part of the public welfare services as well as of the division of labor in society. So while care is a fundamental feature of how families, societies, and economies are organized, care is largely devalued or even neglected in social and economic policy, and therefore carries many injustices and inequalities. There is, however, an increasing political awareness and attention to care, and care has lately become both the subject and object for political debates, interventions, and reforms. In the US and UK context, a care crisis is established as a societal problem that needs to be solved, while in the context of the Nordics, problems relating to issues of care are oftentimes eclipsed by other problems, such as, for example, the graying of society, sustainability of the welfare state, or competence and recruitment problems in the public welfare professional workforce. Feminist and social science scholarship in the Nordic context, such as, for example, in the ethics of care or the feminist political economy traditions, has explored the relationship between care and the broader social order. In particular, issues such as universalism, egalitarianism, and social inequality have been discussed in relation to care work and its societal value and institutional standing. Neoliberal capitalism could be understood in very different manners, but maybe as a rationality, as a form of governance, yet also as a form of social order, is multivocal and articulates differently in various contexts. Nevertheless, neoliberalism has challenged and changed the welfare state through logics at odds with, for example, egalitarianism and universalism. So this situation may represent a disjuncture, a triple movement overlapping Polanyi's description of the structural properties of the double movement. Yet it is also different because of fragmented counter-hegemonic projects in the era of what some might term post-politics. Nancy Fraser has coined the care crisis as a fundamental crisis in the capitalist social order, caused by the inherent contradiction between social reproduction and production in late capitalist welfare states, where, and I quote, capital accords care work little if any value, is unconcerned to replenish it, and seeks to avoid paying for it as insofar as it can, unquote. So contemporary diagnosis of the challenges of our era is, of course, manifold and span over a web of interconnected societal areas. The diagnosis of the late modern and capitalist welfare state are also many, but all point in the same direction. The commons is slowly disappearing through many small but not minor enclosures. In this seminar, we discuss the care crisis, its many articulations and implications within a Nordic welfare state context, and the potential risk of invoking the very concept of crisis in grasping contemporary social and sociological problems. So I will briefly introduce the participant in this panel. So I forgot to introduce myself first. So I am Anette Fagertun. I am an anthropologist, and I will, as I said, moderate this discussion. I come from the area of anthropology and development, and my main interest area is the anthropology of labor and also the anthropology of gender. So I've moved my focus or ethnographic area from Southeast Asia and Indonesia to Norway, the Nordics, and Europe, studying labor and the labor's embeddedness in various institutional arrangements. One of my latest publications in this field is the forthcoming co-edited anthology together with Halvard Vike and Heidi Haukelien, which we have called The Political Economy of Care. Hanne Marlene Dahl is a political scientist who works as a professor at the Department of Social Science and Business at Roskilde University in Denmark, where she is also head of the PhD school. Her research interests are in the governance of care, in feminist theory, and theories of justice. And she has published extensively on these issues in the context of Denmark and Europe. And one of her latest publications is as co-editor of the anthology from 2022, A Care Crisis in the Nordic Welfare State. Heidi Haukelien is an anthropologist working as associate professor at the Center for Care Research South Campus Porsgrunn, University of Southeastern Norway. And she's also hold a senior research position at Telemark Research Institute. Her research interests are in the governance of the welfare state, welfare professional practice, and gender. And she has published extensively on these issues, and in particular focused on elderly care in Norway. One of her latest publications is as co-editor of the anthology from 2023, How Municipalities Think. So Anne-Elise or Lise Widding Isaksen is a sociologist who works as a professor at the Department of Sociology here in University of Bergen. Her research interests are in the ways the nexus of state, market, family shapes positionalities and trajectories in labor markets, with a particular focus on gender, ethnicity, and migration. She has over several decades published extensively on these issues, and one of her latest publications is her co-edited book from 2022, Care Loops and Mobilities in Nordic, Central, and East European welfare states. Halvard Vike is an anthropologist working as a professor at the Department of Health and Social Science, University of Southeastern Norway, where he also is head of the PhD program at the faculty. His research interests include the local democracy, welfare state universalism, and labor in modern organizations, always using a comparative and historical perspective. He has for several decades published extensively on these issues, and one of his latest publications is the forthcoming co-edited anthology together with Fagertun and Haukelien, The Political Economy of Care. So I welcome you and thank you for participating, and I will start with this next session with giving the floor to Hanne Marlene Dahl.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And thank you for this introduction, Anette. When we talk about a care crisis in the Nordic welfare states, we refer to a care crisis that is different than in the liberal welfare regimes like in the US or in the UK, but it's also different from the care crisis in the global south. It's different as the Nordic welfare states are an unlikely place for a care crisis to occur, namely the present context, that of generous universal welfare regimes of the Nordic countries. What Helga Hernes, one of the great political scientists in Norway and also international, called a potentially women-friendly welfare state, and the Nordic welfare states, others have called caring welfare states. So the Nordic welfare states have a care deficit that is different from the care drain that takes place in parts of the global south or the care drain that we witness in parts of Eastern Europe. So the care crisis is increasingly on the scientific agenda. It's not yet on the political agenda. However, what we increasingly witness on the political agenda are some of the symptoms of a care crisis. That is, the problem, the increasing problem of recruiting care professionals, but also keeping them, the retention of care professionals, to recruit them and to keep care professionals so that they don't leave their profession or they don't leave the welfare state to actually take up jobs in private enterprises. So what is not seen politically either is that these problems of recruitment and keeping the care professionals are part of a larger societal problem, that of a care crisis. So the concept of a care crisis is an attempt to get at the larger picture, that of the bird's eye view. And when we study that, which is really difficult to get at when we study care and care work really closely. And I acknowledge that it's a bit pessimistic, it's a bit dystopic picture that emerges out of this bricolage of empirical studies about the work conditions of care, how policy logics are translated, but also how care is performed in creches, nursing homes, kindergartens, home care, sheltered residence, and so on and so forth. This dystopic picture that I'm painting doesn't imply that care is all bad, or that we don't see good enough or even bad care in parts of the Nordic welfare states. We also witness care professionals' struggles to make ends meet and navigate to create time to actually create good care or good enough care, or even to create time for some of the important elements of care. So in this short presentation, I will ask two questions. How do I work with the concept of the care crisis? That's the first question. And the second question is, which kind of inequalities are part of a care crisis? Let me go to the first question, which is about how do I work with or define the care crisis? Together with a colleague, I defined a care crisis as, and I quote, inadequate resources for care and the absence of good enough care. This is a book that Anette was so friendly to refer to about the care crisis in the Nordic welfare states, ? So this is a contextualized notion of a care crisis that in the Nordic caring welfare state. The concept has two dimensions, a quantitative and a qualitative. So the quantitative element is about the extent of care services, but it's also about the form of care provided, the rearticulation of needs so they become thinner, skinnier. It's about self-responsibilizing processes where the capabilities of the individual to care for him or herself is increasingly stressed. Needs are increasingly becoming focused on developing something, developing competencies of children in creches or kindergarten, like language proficiency, social qualification, or of developing or retaining functions, abilities of the elderly in home care or in elderly care, that of rehabilitation. And in hospital, we see the movement from cure and care to being very focused upon cure in very highly intensive and production-oriented hospital. And we also witness that assessment criteria are becoming stricter. So that was a quantitative dimension, that part of inadequate resources for care. The second one is the question of the qualitative dimension of the care actually provided. It's about whether good enough care is actually provided. The characteristics of care, whether it's actually beyond a certain minimum. It doesn't have to be the best care all the time. And the qualitative dimension is also about how some elements of care are silenced or even ignored. We have research from Norway and Denmark that shows that social elements of care, which in Danish perhaps would be called hygge, and in Norway would be called social care, is increasingly ignored or silent. There's a tendency to dismiss them within the governance logics or rationales. And in hospitals, in those highly intensive, production-oriented hospitals, care is increasingly also disappearing, or at least according to the Danish Board of Ethics, they're very concerned about care actually disappearing from hospitals. So Anette referred to an important book that came last year, the book by Nancy Fraser on cannibal capitalism. In this book, there is a focus on capitalism and its various stages and its recent one of financialized capitalism, but also on the negative effects of a certain kind of capitalism on what Lise Widding Isaksen and Haukelien Devi in an earlier work called the commons. That is this thinning or emptying out of the emotional ties, but also what we witness about social exhaustion that Nancy Fraser mentioned and time poverty. We are increasingly stressed and short of time. In another book, there is a focus on what Anette also called neoliberal capitalism and the underfunding of the welfare state. That's in another book on a care crisis, this time in the United Kingdom. That is a book by Emma Dowling. And although both of these books have important insights about the characteristics of the care crisis, there's also something that they don't see very much or they don't focus very much on. So although capitalism in its various forms and the underfunding of the welfare state do shape the care crisis of the Nordic welfare state, that is not the full story. There is another story that supplements this story, and that story is concerned about what happens inside the Nordic welfare states. The way care is governed. It's about paradigms of governance and the logics of care. And please note that I use the logics of care, not a logic of care in singular, but the logics of care. So these paradigms actually form how we think about care and how we think we can govern care and what it means for the way time is used within the welfare state by care professionals. So policy logic still attempts to govern care in a very detailed way, focusing on efficiency, quality, innovation. And logics of care are still downgraded and sometimes even silenced. And then some of you might be very attentive and be saying, what about new public governance? Yes, it's true. New public governance is a new kind of paradigm focusing on trust and co-production, but it doesn't mean that all the old policy logics are simply disappearing. They're actually still there. They're just simply added as a new layer. So this is my attempt to answer the first question about how do I work with the concept of a care crisis? How can we understand the care crisis in this particular context of the Nordic welfare state at this particular juncture? Then I go to the second question. Which kind of inequalities are part of a care crisis? when we look at care research in the Nordic welfare state countries, there is a tradition or a tendency to look at care professional. So there is a focus upon those care professionals within the welfare state. There is a focusing upon how the care professionals experience an increasingly high pace of work, what is traditionally called intensification, of cross pressures, of having to neglect some needs, perhaps also having to neglect some children or some patients or some elderly. There's an increasing inside knowledge about stress, moral distress, burnout, exhaustion, and even of the small things, this fear of forgetting things, and sometimes actually forgetting things, and that in some cases become care failures. So the care professionals increasingly experience moral distress due to not being able to provide the necessary or good enough care. So experiences like these tend to become part of a vicious circle. When there is understaffing, staff shortages, intensification of work, and a governance of details, that feeds into a process of mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion. Experiences that might lead to sickness leave or early retirement. Okay. And so we can actually see developments of vicious circles. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what to say next. Yeah. 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 So we witness a care crisis that is related to working conditions that are formed by underfunding, by particular forms of governance, and by a very detailed form of governance that has detrimental impacts upon care. So the point is here also to say that we both have people inside the welfare state, outside the welfare state, and we still have very gendered uptake of care, both within the welfare state, but also outside. Those outside the welfare state that are actually stitching together the holes in the patchwork of care. And that, as we know from a long history of gender research, is very much taken care of by women still. And although we still have intersectionalities of class and racialization, and we also, as masculinity researchers, has focused upon that there's important changes within masculinities occurring within the Nordic welfare state, we still see and witness a very strongly gendered labor market, but also a very strongly gendered informal care work. So I will just briefly, and I have 1 minute now. Yes, I'm rushing. So what I wanted to say is that we have this picture of the caring, potentially women-friendly welfare state. That picture we have to deconstruct because we have an emerging care crisis. And that care crisis also brings us to think critically about the concept of universalism. And my last note is here to actually reintroduce something that I have earlier noticed, is that this universalism of the Nordic welfare state is still not sufficiently sensitive to gendered problems in a way. So there's a kind of institutional bias in the Nordic welfare state. So summarizing now is that this care crisis is very special. It needs to be understood in a particular institutional context. And this care crisis was originally unlikely to happen, but it is happening, and it actually has very, very serious implications for the sustainability of the Nordic welfare state. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here, and my paper is about care crisis and trust. The Scandinavian countries are well known for having a high degree of mutual trust among citizens, service recipients, and the public and political institutions. In this presentation, I will explore what are the mechanisms producing trust? What significance does this trust have for the sustainability of the welfare state? And what happens with equality and equal access to care when institutional changes undermines trust? The present Norwegian government has declared that the trust reform in the public sector is among the most important projects. We must assume that it is important because the government is concerned that trust has diminished, and it considers trust to be fundamental. And clearly, underlying this initiative, there is a great concern about reduced trust. The trust reform aims to encourage more bottom-up processes. Trust in street-level professionals is emphasized. It turns out that most trust reform projects are found in the healthcare and especially elderly care. The phenomenon of trust. Over the last decades, trust, political legitimacy, and state accountability have become central topics in social science, partly due to the widespread experiences of welfare retrenchment and economic and democratic decay in Western welfare states, and partly due to the fact that politicians, economists, and social researchers alike now increasingly question the welfare state's affordability, sustainability, and efficiency. The high degree of trust in public institutions in Scandinavian countries is related to historical processes creating egalitarian organizational forms and institutions with grassroots control. That means institutions with influence from below, mutual social control, and cross-cutting conflicts and interests. Nurses. Nurses who is my primary example here, have historically had a significant degree of influence over their own profession, and they have had the opportunity to exercise a high degree of discretion and autonomy in their profession. The long tradition of expanding welfare services have created a strong belief and trust among the service providers that their good work will be approved by responsible decision makers. Their professional identity has been closely linked to an optimistic belief in the expansion and development of the welfare state. They have been credible advocates for quality improvements and capacity enhancements. It is well documented that nurses have taken an overall responsibility for service quality and have gone beyond what has been strictly contractually defined to compensate for capacity shortages. They have adhered to different kinds of contract, a different type of contract, and what Palumbo and Scott, among others, call common values or commons. The social relations involved can be described as pre-contractual and produce the social capital necessary for complex institutions like public organized care to function. When during my earlier fieldworks in Norwegian nursing homes in the late 1990s, nurses and nursing assistants expressed the feeling of being responsible for the whole, even though surely their mandate could be interpreted as much more limited. I see this as an illustration of a moral discourse and commitments emerging from specific constellations of trust. I have few reasons to believe that such statements were strategic, as I always observed them doing their jobs. According to Richard Sennett, the ability of street-level personnel to make discretionary judgments depends on the opportunity to exploit organizational weaknesses and cracks, allowing them, for example, to spend extra time dealing with new challenges while relying on managers who protect their backs as part of a shared commitment to the common goods. The institutional reforms that the healthcare and eldercare sector has undergone in the last 20 to 30 years in Scandinavian and other Western countries have changed the foundation of this contract in ways that reduces professional autonomy, reduces influence, reduces control over quality and conditions of care practice. Elderly care has, over the past 2 decades, become the source of major worries as a long-time predicted scenario of an elderly wave threatening to suffocate the economy and undermine sustainability has become discursively more real. We have got tighter control, more outcome measurements, and strong focus on needs assessments, centralization of political and administrative power and authority, including the establishment of the purchaser-provider split. This in turn have transformed previously flat organizations into hierarchical ones. Just check. Yeah. If you follow my argument that trust emerge from experiences with institutions that are predictable, controllable, and influenceable, and where interests intersect in ways that prevent the development of purely hierarchical interest groups pitted against each other, then this development is worrisome in terms of trust, quality, and equality of care. On the contemporary scene, we are witnessing what appears to be a major shift towards more polarized divisions between administrative leaders in the municipal health and care sector and street-level employees. During my more recent fieldworks, I observed that professionals increasingly find it challenging to express their opinion and initiate discussions on the repercussions of budget reductions for service quality, sometimes even perceiving it as risky. Even in local institutions, a discourse of personal loyalty to employer is gaining force, something which strongly limits the street-level professionals' ability to make themselves relevant in issues beyond the technicalities related to the deliveries for which they are responsible. A prevailing trend appears to be that expressing concerns within institutional settings or through public media often results in being summoned by the management. So, what are the consequences of reduced trust? Already in my fieldworks in the beginning of 2000, I saw trends of alienation among nurses. They discussed how far they were willing to go to compensate for resource shortages. About 20 years later, it seems that the nurses' strategies have changed in interesting ways. Some nurses appear to have given up the ambition of taking overall responsibility for patients and instead pragmatically identify with the municipality's ambition to downsize services. They take responsibility for informing patients and relatives about the limits of what the municipality is responsible for, and they seem to have resigned or pragmatically adopted in line with their limited ability to influence the conditions for professional practice. They seem to have lost trust in the welfare state's proclaimed ambition to provide dignified conditions for all elderly individuals, and they're taking active they actively take part in the realization of gradual shift of the welfare state from emphasizing care to facilitating self-help. What I suggest here is that nurses' lack of trust will have far-reaching and reinforcing consequences for what we identify as an ongoing crisis in the public care sector. Consequences of increased inequality between those who have the resources to acquire care from other sources than the public sector and those who lack this possibility. Another consequence already visible in reduced application numbers for nursing education is that the nursing profession becomes less attractive and the shortage of nurses will increase. And then we have a mutually reinforcing downward spiral. Not very optimistic, I'm sorry, but thank you.
Yeah, the title of my paper is The Crisis of Care, and I want to discuss the crisis of care from a mobility perspective. And according to recent research on precarious work is now universal, but its forms vary across countries, and relations between the welfare states and markets are thus very central to the experience of precarious work. So what we have done in our book is that we understand the gender, racialized, and socially stratified aspects of precarious work, and we think it requires a more intersectional oriented approach. So I start with a quote from an article on precarious work that was published last week, where it's a quote from the European Parliament from 1920. Women in the global north are disproportionately represented in precarious jobs, and that are in low-paid caregiving and domestic work in the service sector. This type of work is also about part-time, reflecting the demands on women to balance service work and their family responsibilities. And in this context, the double burden for women is especially stark where work is caregiving in the service sector and family life is about care at home. So, however, care at home is not only unpaid work for your family. Paid domestic work for employers' families is often a response to the care crisis in many different countries. In our book, we have explored local and transnational care mobilities. We have discussed how care increasingly has become transnational, structured by transforming welfare state and the neoliberal responses to care deficits and crisis management. It means that in most of the welfare states that we have explored, solve the care crisis problems by importing care labor from poorer countries, or they solve the crisis by using access to different kinds of informal unpaid labor in families. So it's outsourcing of labor troubles to families, and it's import of care workers from poorer countries. And we have used the concept of care loops and cross-border mobilities to understand how care has become a mobility problem, not only in local settings, but also in rural and urban settings in Nordic, Central, and East European countries. Public care services are still important, but informal solutions like paid domestic care has become more socially accepted and a preferred care practice, especially for middle-class families in more affluent countries. In Northern, Central, and Eastern European countries, care provisions continues to be mainly local, and migrant care workers are complementary still. We have studied the local complexities of care with a focus on mobilities, and we have particularly looked into local care loops, which means the mobilities from home to childcare to work and back again, and how these circles imply different kinds of social relationships, how the mobilities are socially stratified and also related to other inequality aspects. We have also used the care as patchwork concept, which is a concept from an Italian sociologist from the 1980s, also Laura Balbo. And in the care loops concept, we are inspired by mobility sociology, particularly a pioneer like John Urry. And we want to use the care loops concept because it is a micro level interactionist concept that is oriented towards an analysis of and interpretations of complex social relations during the day. So many researchers used to do kind of institutional interactionist studies, but by introducing a care loops concept, we are enabled to look into what is not only about logistics, but also all the social interactions that happens to you while you are moving from one place to another. For instance, we know that if you are looking into who delivers and who picks up children in kindergartens, we know that this is a gendered issue. If we tend to, in Norway, for instance, father often deliver the children, but mothers pick up because fathers, for instance, prefer to work a little late. So mothers prefer to go a little earlier from work to pick up the children. So this is also a middle-class problem because middle-class mothers prefer to pick up the children before the kindergarten closes, because being the latest child in the kindergarten is kind of a very social stigmatic issue. And also when it comes to, for instance, from in the public home health services, we know that the traveling from one house to another is not only about traveling, it's also about eating your daily lunch while you're traveling from one house to another. So it's a lot of things that happens when you are going from one place to another. So we are trying to use the kind of mobility perspective to explore these activities. So we have used also this is the care as patchwork. And this is a kind of a concept that has been very much used in European feminist research. It's also about how you organize your everyday activities related to research. Is kind of that to put focus on that not every day are alike, that you have to make your care practices according to what is available, what is the health standards in the family, the day you make the care services, and so on. So it's also about local geographies and also about the distances that need to be connected to the loops. For instance, we have, in Denmark, I know there have been kind of project trying to learn migrant women how to use bicycles, for instance, to do the daily shopping and to bring the children to kindergartens and schools. So this is also a part of the care mobilities that is of importance here, and also how you kind of try to mix different kinds of things together, how you can learn migrant women to use the bike, how you can shop without paying for the bus transfer, and so on. So this is it's a concept that we used in our studies in the different countries. So we have studied kind of 3 Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Central and Eastern Europe, we studied Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovenia, and Russia. So we are not exactly looking into the care crisis concept. We have kind of redefined it as a kind of a question related to the new normal. It's a kind of a normalization process. And it's related to 2 different things. One is a normalization process related to de-skilling and increasing reliance on a vulnerable workforce, like for instance, migrant workers. 2 is related to refamiliarization, moving care from institutions to families and private households. And these responses produce new care crises, systemic deficits, and also care loopholes. So how does the new normal look like? Defamiliarization policies have taken informal care for granted. So care has become a kind of a free good or taken for granted issue. And welfare states seem to return to the essentialist idea that some groups of women are forming a kind of an available caregiver pool available for local authorities and local welfare states. What we find is that in the similarities, there is a return to essentialist idea. And second, that the changing care-related mobilities in all societies in the form of longer and shorter care loops or in the form of more cross-border and transnational care loops. On the local level, there are more informal care done by grandmothers and daughters, also in some contexts, also fathers and sons. In the post-socialist democratic societies, the increase of cross-border care loops are more present than in the Nordic societies. So in Nordic, Central and Eastern European states have a common social political heritage. That's why we wanted to compare these different welfare states. But however, there is a diversity of gender egalitarian ideals and care loops among nations included in our studies. But we found that, for instance, the study from Russia showed that there are very gender rural care pools, which means that, for instance, in parts of Russia, for instance, in rural Mongolia, instead of closing public schools, the local teachers took over the schools and teach the children for free. So it was a kind of a quick fix of a very local care crisis. In Slovenia, for instance, public childcare is very gendered, but it's also very accepted. So 90% of children in Slovenia attend a public childcare. But the traditional division of labor in the family still exists. What's happening in Slovenia is that in elder care, people are increasingly doing cross-border care loops because there are cheaper care in Croatia, the neighbor country. So if you have, for instance, a very dependent mother and father, you can send her to Croatia, to an elder care home in Croatia, because it's cheaper than it is to take care of her in Slovenia. Also, in the staff problems in Slovenia, elder care is solved by importing kind of cheaper Bosnian women from Croatia to do the elder care in Slovenia. In the Czech Republic, there is an intergenerational care contract, means that women are retiring earlier than men because they form a kind of an informal care pool it is expected from them to kind of be a caring grandmother and take care of the grandchildren for free. In Hungary, we have kind of a public maternalism. It means that also that the earlier welfare state that Hungary had before Orban and the new politics is that women or female employment is in decrease, and also the public support for working mothers has been reduced. Before the war in Ukraine, it was a kind of a very normal to kind of import women from the Ukraine to do the elder care in Hungarian homes. How it is now, I don't know, but probably they have women from Moldova or some other neighboring country to care for the elderly in need of care. Because very many of, for instance, rural Hungarian women leave their own country to care for people in Austria and in Germany. In Poland, we have a kind of a private maternalism, means that after during the 1990s, most public kindergartens were closed because public childcare had a kind of very bad reputation for being kind of communist and cold care and overcrowded, badly staffed, and so on. So private family care is the preferred care. And also they have the elder care is also like in Hungary. The solution for elder care problem is to introduce a retirement policy for women can retire at 64 instead of 67, for instance, to form a kind of a national caregiver pool. So it's the refamiliarization politics. In the Nordic countries, we have two solutions. For one, we have among kind of middle-class families, there was for many, many years an increase in the use of au pairs. In Norway, 94% of au pairs came from the Philippines. After the pandemics, there are kind of less than 500 au pairs in Norway. It used to be about 2,500, 3,000. What is interesting now is that we have an increase in what we name as kind of traveling grandmothers or flying grandmothers, which means that there seems to be an increase of informal solutions in transnational families. It means that, for instance, if you come from an African country like Somalia, or if you come from the Philippines, when you give birth to a child, you can have a grandmother visiting to stay with you, to come to kind of do the traditional childbirth visit. So this is a new phenomenon that we still haven't done very much research on, but 2 or 3 kind of master theses discuss this transnational care practices. So to come to how do the Nordic societies look like? We still have a dual earner and dual care models. And it must be said that 95% of fathers today take the daddy leave. So the masculinity ideals are changing. But still, we have a third shift that is highly gendered, and it is particularly gendered in middle-class families and also partly in working-class families. But it's kind of the masculinities ideals are changing, but the housework is still a problem among also modern families. Care mobilities, we have the daily on-the-clock care loops between dependent people homes done by home helpers. And also we have au pair families that was kind of for a short moment among politicians, they had the idea that we should kind of use au pairs also for elder care. But after the au pair agreement closed down, this idea disappeared. We have also still care migration in Norway, Norway, Sweden, and also Denmark and Finland, I think. An interesting solution of the care crisis is also to import nurses and also import other care workers. Also we have a kind of a practice based on integration practices for refugees, so that they are kind of learning Norwegian while they're doing care work in childcare institutions or also in elder care homes. So we have a more transnational and more racialized caregiver pool today than we had, for instance, compared to 10 or 20 years ago. So what we need is kind of, instead of ending this debate with the idea that the care crisis has come to stay, I think we should take a look at what's happening in, for instance, among British sociologists, that they ask, for instance, isn't it time to go for a more visionary, utopian thinking and new scenarios? And I want to quote Fiona Williams. She wrote, for instance, European scholars has recently called for a prefigurative policy aimed to inspire commitment and interest in creating good images and strategies for a fairer, solidarity-based and environmentally friendly welfare. So she asked for a kind of a more broad discussion of, is it possible to introduce a concept like eco-feminist commons? Should we think about a sustainable welfare state in combination with kind of more embodied care? Should embodied care be seen as kind of a green care? And she thinks that we need kind of a future where care is about being in time. She's quoting Hannah Arendt here. We need to have a care about being in time versus a care that is based on being on time. And also I want to kind of quote Kari Martinsen, that is a very well-known care philosopher in Norway. She was interviewed in Morgenbladet last week, and she, as the headline for her interview was, "Care is an anti-capitalist resistant policy." And she also asked, for a kind of a need for another language. We need other metaphors. We need another language, not only customers, we need more kind of a human language when we're talking about care, and we also need a more care-oriented economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be a part of this. And my purpose is to try to throw some light on long-term care, universalism, and reproduction with the Nordic or Scandinavian welfare state as my main example. And I use the expression long-time care in a broad sense here, rather loose, but I'm referring to the kind of basic commitments that the Scandinavian welfare states have made in the area of care for children and the elderly, mainly, but also a long range of other kinds of services and forms of support. First, in order to understand the significance of long-term care, I would very much like to insist that within the context of Gösta Esping Andersen, for instance, or Peter Baldwin, the three worlds of capitalism, the crisis of care that we are now talking about is a global crisis, and it is, in my views, basically about the essential democratic contract between, at least in democratic countries, between population and the government, and the government's or the national government's ability to assume responsibility that are quite demanding. And insofar as these kinds of services illuminate some very basic, but very often ignored by political scientists, commitments made by states and commitments related to very important ambitions and shared ambitions among populations, it's a more interesting prism to welfare states and Western democracies, or democracies in general, than what is normally thought. And that is one of the reasons why I think that the expression "a generous welfare state" is quite misplaced, and where very often it is used descriptively, and that's fine, but it very often also hint to some kind of moral generosity and some kind of asymmetrical reciprocity between the happy receiving clients on the one hand and the generous state on the other. Well, as Espen Andersen and Peter Baldwin and many others have pointed out, the welfare state in the Nordic Scandinavia is in many ways a very interesting history of solidarity and the emergence of solidarity, or some sorts and forms of solidarity, in context where there were deep inequalities. So that what I'm concerned with here is partly to understand the emergence of these kinds of basic alliances, like long-term care really is, from a very divided type of society that created alliances on a broad basis and commitments on the part of states that are much more comprehensive and heavy than in most other states, and which created some kind of ability on the part of the population to make really strong, heavy, demanding claims. So this is the very opposite to a generous welfare state, I think. And that has a lot to do with reproduction, of course. And here I refer to, again, Espen Andersen's analysis in 2002, why we need a new welfare state, focusing heavily on family policy and social policy broadly, arguing that without these kinds of extensive and growing commitments on the part of the state to meet the kinds of demands that, for instance, feminist interests have demanded for a very long time, it's simply impossible to secure the reproduction of basic functions in welfare capitalist states, like the reproduction of the labor force, gender equality, and many other things. Reproduction is, of course, an aspect of a much bigger problem, not only reproducing the labor force or reproducing some kind of equality, but I would insist also that understanding long-term care and its significance as an area of policy, it also is about democratic reproduction, or the democratic sustainability. Insofar as sustainability has to do with mechanisms or aspects of social relations or human beings' relations to nature, it's based on some deep kinds of ability to care for common goods, for sharing, for mutual commitments, and those kinds of essential aspects of social life, aspects that tend to be very heavily undermined in Fraser's, in Fraser's term, cannibal capitalism. And I would like to point out here that I find that care policies are really a good and interesting example, very often ignored to my mind, of common goods, the commons. I do think that it's a very good example because it's is incredibly I talked about the obligation that this enforces states to take, and it's of course very demanding. We could talk more about that, but elderly care, for instance, is a brilliant example of how challenging it is to control and govern and steer an area of service provision that is so completely unpredictable and varied and changing all the time. It's almost natural that it is based on a high degree of professional autonomy, for instance, and local municipal autonomy. I'll get back to that, but this is what interests me in terms of common goods. But historically, care commitments have a lot to do with the politicization of women's interests. It's a deeply feminist interest, of course, and I really think that that is part of the reason why long-term care has become such a grandiose success as a policy area in the Scandinavian welfare state. It has a lot to do with sharing, and it's interesting historically also, or in comparative terms, to realize and see the implications of the fact that care has become a top political priority. In no other Western democracy that has happened, it seems to me. And as I said, it highlights some aspects of mutual commitments in politics and in institutional life that I think is not only interesting in terms of what would it take to reproduce the welfare state, but also to try to understand why did the welfare state, or the most extended version in the Scandinavian case, how did it emerge in the first place? I think that historians have been quite sloppy in terms of trying to explain this phenomenon. And one of the things that interests me a lot in that context is universalism, because universalism is very often demonstrated to be a very important aspect of the Scandinavian welfare state, and it's described as a technical approach sometimes, but its most interesting aspect to me is that universalism emerged quite early. The first examples were in Denmark in the late 1800s, but they developed in very divided society as practical solutions to deal with the kinds of problems that people had with class divisions. For instance, the early women's interests experimenting with elderly care and childcare just were based to a very high degree on self-interest. It's very difficult and a clumsy thing to do to distinguish between people's social status when you need members and you need to share work. And of course, this kind of collective organization for realizing self-interest was situated in a society, especially in northern Scandinavia, that was deeply characterized by a shortage of labor. So that this is a very important way to understand sharing at the deeper level. But the sensational aspect of universalism, as I see it, is that it became a systematic way to separate the distribution of services from social status. That has not happened in any other Western states to any deep extent. And this is something that really, I think, explains some important aspects of egalitarianism, which has to do with institutions and not about cultural heritage. Okay, so explaining universalism is to me an interesting a challenge in terms of addressing questions about a welfare state and democratic sustainability in the future. I will not talk about welfare state convergence here because there's a limited amount of time. 5 minutes? So yes, women's interests and volunteer organizations, that are those were the the basic elements of the early Scandinavian welfare states and study how they organized their activities and interests is very important. They were taken over by municipalities and then taken over by the central states. But that illustrates also that the welfare state is not generous in the sense that the state has decided to provide services to people. The origin was the opposite. It was a self-interest project, and it was organized not because it was supposed to be made universal. It was universalist in the beginning. The threats to universalism has come during the last 30 years for reasons that the other speakers have touched. But and the significance of social status here is the basic aspect of this, it seems to me. And one of the important things to explore in this emergence of the welfare state, let's say in the post-Second World War era, is to try to explore and explain how these services that had been developed by women's organizations and municipalities from quite early in the 19th or the 20th century especially, how they could expand so enormously. Why? How do we explain the expansion process during the post-war era? And that is, to me, a very important entry into understanding the decentralized form of the traditional welfare state in Scandinavia. It was never a welfare state. It was mainly a set of welfare municipalities extending the interest and systematizing the interests of volunteer organizations. And it strikes me a lot that during this period, there were no firm governance. There were no firm control on the part of the central state of municipalities. Municipalities were incredibly, until the 80s, very autonomous, and professional groups had a very strong sense of autonomy, and they were not controlled by any institutional systematic means whatsoever. So this is something that interests me a lot. This is a myth among many political scientists that the welfare state needs some kind of control. But this, well, of course it does. Of course it does. But the reason why it really grew is very, very uncontrolled system of institutional, not evolution, but development according to local needs, and arrangements that were really defined and designed according to the logics of care, which we could talk more about, but there's no time to do that. Yes, and I would just point out at the end that it has the universalism and the universalism that have been possible to achieve through certain institutional mechanisms related to care work and provision of care have had much more lasting effects than we tend to think. The lasting effects of universalism are really important, and they may give us some reason to be less pessimistic than we often tend to be. But yeah, I would like to say much more, but there's no time to do that. I just comment on this current discourse of long-time care. In Norway now, we've had two important commissions who have had a deep influence on public discourse in Norway concerning the future of the welfare state. The one is the Health Personnel Commission that has concluded that the scarcity of labor will be so great that we just have to kind of hope that long-time care will be solved by technological solutions or whatever. It has been a complete depoliticization of this debate, and this is interesting also because it's so anti-feminist and it's so based on the idea that well, specific ideas of gendered labor, which makes it's really strange that it's possible to conclude that from the fact that there are difficulties recruiting or making nurses, for instance, stay in work, that we have to deconstruct the welfare state because of scarcity of labor. It's a quite absurd idea. The other thing is that the Generalist Municipality Commission has concluded in very much the same way, which I read as a naturalization of the idea that the time of the welfare state is over. And this raises the question of, to me, how can we as researchers, for instance, contribute to the understanding of the incredible importance this very strange welfare state experiment has had. Its long-term effects are, as I tried to say, much bigger than and more important than most people tend to think. And in terms of the democratic, not only care crisis that we currently see on a broad basis, really depend on forms of policies, forms of human activities that enable us to develop broad and deep solidarities. And that's something that characterizes long-term care more than anything else. Thank you.
So thank you to all panel participants, and I would like to invite you up to here, and I will just fetch my glasses. So now I think it's the time to open the floor for questions and comments from the audience, both here and online. So I think I will just do that. So if there are any questions, I don't see anything on the screen here, but maybe we can start here with the audience present. Are there any, maybe to the whole panel or to one of these? Maria.
Hi, is this, okay, yeah, sure. Well, the question is mainly to Dahl, but perhaps others can also chime in. But I was wondering about this idea of the Nordic welfare states being the most unlikely place. If you could elaborate a bit on why it's unlikely.
You want me to answer that straight away, or do you want to
Yeah, I think so. Yes, please. And maybe we should, yeah.
Well, the Nordic welfare state, as Halvard also said, which is sort of the commonplace reception within the comparative welfare state literature, is that those welfare states are very unusual.
They're very have very extensive, very generous care services. So in that sense, a lot of the care needs should be met already. So that makes it a quite unlikely case. If you, for instance, compare the Nordic welfare states to liberal welfare states like the UK or the US, that's traditionally perceived as very, very narrow welfare states where welfare services are very narrow, targeted the very poor or very stigmatized parts of the population. So you don't have very broad or very generous welfare services in that sense. People have to pay themselves, so to speak, through the market, like kindergarten, like nursing homes, unless they have insurance in relation to their job, so to speak. So that would mean that those care services are very narrow and not provided by the welfare states. But if you compare to the Nordic welfare states, that is a tax finance sort of welfare state with a lot of services provided to the most people, and the uptake is also by most people. So it's not such that it's only the poor or the middle classes who uses the welfare state, but what we see that most of the classes actually uses the welfare state, and usually that was the perception in the literature so far, was that these services were also of a relatively high quality. That is changing, and that is my argument, that there are becoming the sort of, due to neoliberalism and self-responsibilization, those services are becoming narrower, so to speak. And that is why it's an unlikely context, because they have traditionally been perceived as universal and generous, but now they're less generous, so to speak. So they're restricting access and changing the forms of care that they provide. I hope that was sufficient.
Yeah, thank you. Any one of you would like to add something on this? No?
There was another question as well.
Yeah, okay. It's done. Yeah.
Working. So there is an interesting discrepancy between Harald and the three of you, in the sense that Harald sort of describes a sort of fundamental optimistic political alliance that is somehow still in place, if I listen well to him, which would then sort of help to prevent the further slide towards, capitalist care. Let's not even call it neoliberal, but capitalist care. So basically, okay. But the three of you are much more pessimistic. You describe, in fact, more precisely the sort of slide over the last 20 years, whereas Harald is not so strong on the last 20 years in a certain sense, because of his long-term vision. So as a non-Scandinavian at this point, I wonder, should I be optimistic about the capacity of Scandinavian societies to keep this social democratic feminist alliance going and restore to care the symbolic and practical importance it had for the Scandinavian social contract, given new public management and all that, the neoliberalization of care, and given the taking away of professional autonomy, which I think was very greatly described in your talk, on the part of nurses and on the part of all sorts of care providers. What I see in the Netherlands is the enormous spread of IT and the internet and the factual organization of care, which leads to a further disempowerment of professional workers on the care shop floor. And so, now, given that whole context, how optimistic should we be about the capacity of Scandinavian society to talk back to that?
Thank you. So I think this is a question to all of you.
Yeah.
Anyone like to start?
Yeah,
Halvard?
I'd love to try to address your question, which was very interesting and thought-provoking. My immediate response would be that there are indeed very good reasons, or yeah, very good reasons for being very pessimistic. I agree completely with all the other speakers. But at the same time, the institutional infrastructure of the welfare state is still, interestingly, I think, partly intact. In Norway, it's striking that we still have reasonably strong and very often many or very strong municipalities, well-functioning local democracies and local bureaucracies serving people in this all kinds of strange places. I mean, places where service provision is very demanding because of the geography and things like that. But in order to even deal seriously with the idea of restoring the welfare state for a new period would demand a completely reorganization of how these institutions are run. And in that sense, my optimism is naive, because that is not likely to happen. But at least it's possible to say that it's not obviously that it's too late. But it depends probably on being much better to enable each other to understand what kind of achievement this has been, not in terms of the moral quality of the welfare state, that's not the point, but its enormous contribution to social integration and democratic sustainability. But Sweden is perhaps the best example of where we're going. I mean, it's not obvious either that Norway or Denmark is going in the Swedish direction, but the degree of privatization, commercialization, re-commodification, re-hierarchicalization, elite appropriation of the common goods is just a radical experience.
Yeah, Hanne.
Yeah, well, thank you for that thought-provoking question. I'm not certain that I can answer it fully, but I'll give it a shot. I think you can, I mean, the answer to that question depends on a lot of things, your personal optimism or pessimism, or critical analysis of what I believe is a critical juncture right now in the Nordic welfare state. Or you could also base it on historical analysis. And from the context of the Danish welfare state, I can see that there was a reimagination of the Nordic welfare state, or in the Danish welfare state, in the 70s and the 80s, based on criticism of both from the right and from the left. And so in that sense, I have some basic trust that it might reimagine itself, at least in Denmark, because I also think there are important differences in the strategies and also the conditions or context of Finland, Sweden, and then Norway and Denmark. It seems that there is a sort of divergence within the so-called Nordic model. But then when I then also critically has to sort of looking at the sort of strategies that politicians and are pursued at the state level, then on the other hand, I become much more pessimistic, because there's sort of currently 3 or 4 strategies employed. One is migration strategies to solve the problem. Another one is improved leadership, more trust, new public governance. And then there is the third one, which is an incredible, I would say in Danish, jubeloptimistic, an incredible optimistic view of what new technologies can do and change and reduce care work. And when I look at those, I mean, as you know, as a lot of, or some feminists, including myself, have also looked at, it doesn't seem that those are actually going to work very well. And also taking into account that migration is going to create problems of ethics and justice in relation to other parts of the world. So in that sense, I become more pessimistic. So I'm sort of struggling at the moment, but that was my part of an answer to your question. Thank you.
Do you want to? Yeah.
Yes.
No, I want to stress the kind of the points from the British sociologists and how they kind of respond to the care crisis by trying to introduce more visionary concepts. So even if we kind of, even if we are pessimistic at this stage of history, there might be possibilities to reimagine a new future for the welfare state. It's not given that the normalization of the neoliberal status and the care crisis will continue forever. So it is also possible to discuss what does the common good mean, and can we reorganize the common good and make it more meaningful on the local levels, like in the municipalities, which actually happens for 50 years ago. This was also the point of Helga Hernes. Well, how did the kind of the potentially women-friendly state, how was it made? It was made because it was an alliance from voluntary associations from below, together with the trade unions, together with the political parties, and from there, from the below and to the top, it was a great collaboration that turned into become a kind of an alliance between the labor movement and the women's movement, which pressed for a kind of a new future for the welfare state, a more friendly welfare state, a more women-friendly welfare state, a more caring welfare state. So actually, if we use the same model to think if we can reorganize the future of the welfare state, we can start with the discussion of, is this model also a model we can use for the future? Do we need to kind of integrate more of the ecological thinking in this model? How can we kind of make an eco-friendly common welfare state? Because we also need to take into consideration that there is a climate change going on. We have to think to integrate this in our thinking. So I think it is kind of very exciting that the British sociologist has introduced the concept of, is it a future for a kind of an eco-friendly welfare state? So that's a starting point to kind of make better visions.
Yeah, thank you for the question, which I think is very hard to answer. I think it's very, I hope you're right, that it's possible to think different about these things and to think of the different crises as interrelated, because there are crises not only in care, but in the nature and in all the society arenas. So I hope that it's possible to be optimistic. But among other things, I teach nurses. And one of the most important things I try to learn them is that their voice is important. And I think that the nurses' voice and all the other female workers need to raise their voice, and we need to see the production and reproduction as two sides of the same system. But how can we make politicians and the capitalist forces to realize that? The politicians are optimistic. They talk about co-creation, and we're going to, the solution is welfare technology, and everything is going to be all right. But I think there are other solutions. I don't believe in maybe co-creation to some point, but not welfare technology. I don't believe that is a solution of the welfare crisis. But we need to upgrade the care work in all its aspects. But how to do that? Yeah. Someone has to do the answer.
Thank you. Can I just check? Oh, yeah, thanks. Are we, how
Are we on time? Are we?
5 minutes late.
We are 5 minutes. Yeah. So Do we have some more minutes? Yeah. All right. Yeah, I know. All right. But okay, because we have questions also here and after in. So, oi. Can anyone help me to read? Okay, there is a long question. Certification of foreign education has become harder. This seems to be a form of underutilization of population's capacity to provide care. Has the prioritization of native-born care providers become a barrier in providing care? Yeah, so it's about how the Norwegian system, in a sense, recognize or not the qualifications of immigrants and refugees coming from outside or working in the healthcare sector. So the question is, has the prioritization of native-born care providers or care workers become a barrier in providing care? Lisa.
Actually, there are many programs going on to kind of recruit and also use the kind of care nursing homes and other care institutions as a kind of a learning area for people in need of learning Norwegian. And also there is a recruitment process going on also to get more migrant men into care. So that people are offered kind of a certificate as professional care workers, and also offer the stable jobs in the care sector. So the diversity among care workers is growing. It's more men, it's more people from different continents, from Africa, from Syria, from many other continents, but also among the elderly population, there are more Pakistanis, there are more people from Asia, from Iraq, they're also growing older and so on. So the culture of care is also changing. And even if the institutional frames remain quite stable, there are a lot of processes going on inside the care institutions, in nursing homes, also in hospitals, even if there are kind of some hierarchical problems that, for instance, it's difficult for instance, Syrian doctors to get the full certification of their education and so on. But still, it is many different programs going on to integrate migrants in different levels of care in the welfare state.
We have one more from the audience here. Yeah.
Right. So my question really goes back to a way of life in the Nordics, which emphasizes the care homes, which is where the caring happens. And it's unfortunate that we, and I mean us who work at GRIP and HVL, we ended up not having the other part, which would have concentrated on other continents and the care crisis there, which would have solved this problem that I have in my head based on what I've heard now of the role of Ubuntu, for example. So you have the crisis here, which is we are inadequately staffed, and certification being another, but also farming out the caring of the elderly or people who are the vulnerable. Whereas back home in Zimbabwe, that is, you are your brother's keeper, your parents grow old, they move in with you, and life goes on. So I wonder if by focusing on the welfare state, if we are not ceding, number one, it's too much power to the state itself. But again, number two, and perhaps more importantly, too much responsibility that we should otherwise have ourselves, and farming it out, and then we are creating this crisis that might not exist if we were to just adopt a different way of life, which is difficult because this is how it is in Norway, right? So I naively ask this question knowing that this is how it is, but as we are theorizing in the academy, could this be a question that we could be seized with? And then lastly is there's pessimism on technology. But the ILO just last week released the report, right, that was very optimistic on the augmentation of care work specifically and the use of new technology. And they were saying it's not coming to replace, but to complement. And life will be better after that. So I guess it would make for another 2-hour discussion, but something to just throw out there so that we can chew on. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the first one, this issue about the responsibility of the state or the welfare regime. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question about the way of life. Well, I think that the dual earner model, which was instigated in the Nordic welfare states earlier than in some of the other Western countries, that you could both have part-time, that you could be both a mother and a daughter and then have full-time work, was a sort of class and gender compromise that was sort of set in the 70s and the 80s. And that created a kind of responsibility both for families, read women still, but also for the state. And so in that sense, it was not just based upon the state taking over all of the responsibilities, but taking over most of the responsibilities. So in that sense, it was a sort of a gender and class compromise that sort of has worked so far, but doesn't work any longer, so to speak. And I also think that you're right in saying that the Nordic welfare state has become part of everyday life. It's something that you have to rely on if you are a full-time employee, either in the private sector or in the state or in NGOs. So in that sense, it has become a necessity. So in that sense, it's becoming very difficult to dismantle. But on the other hand, I think we are now at a critical juncture where we, as both feminists, but also as people engaged in developing and understanding and theorizing the Nordic welfare state, has to understand that something new is happening, that something is at stake that doesn't really work that well, but which one believed was going to work well 40 years ago. And then my last comment is about the notion of the state, because I think there are different perceptions of the state, because if you look at how people in the Nordics perceive the state, they're very optimistic if you look at it comparatively. As soon as you go down to Europe or in other places, the view of the state is usually much more negative in a sense. The state is much more seen as disciplining and so on. So in that sense, there is something particularly about the emergence of the welfare state that Halvard has stressed, but also my other good colleague about trust, that sort of has developed a huge amount of trust in the Nordic welfare state to both solve societal and political problems. So that's why it's not so easy to change, because there's a lot of institutional interest and there's a lot of everyday interest in that we now rely on creches and kindergartens and nursing homes. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to discuss the technology issue. I think I agree with you that the ILO has a positive view, but it's also dependent on what kind of technology you combine with what kind of persons. For instance, if a lot of people are suffering from Alzheimer, from dementia, and if you kind of, you need to combine them with persons that can handle the machines. If you are dement or if you have an Alzheimer, a speaking machine that kind of give you medical doses, with kind of making you crazy because you don't know what happens when a machine suddenly start talking to you. But there are a lot of practical solutions that can be used, for instance, in nursing homes, and that can, for instance, washing the floors or kind of using technology like that. That is, of course, very important also for surveillance, that you can have kind of some kinds of technology where you can call for help when you need help, that's so. But another thing is that what do we do with all technology when they are turning into waste? I mean, we also need to ask the green issues here. So how are they made? And who produced them? And what do we do with them then when we can't use them anymore? So this is also a part of the technology issue that I think we have to have in mind.
Very good.
Yeah.
Did you? Yeah.
Thank you for your very interesting question. And it's very fruitful because it makes you think about how can this be reconciled, these different contradictions that we see now are growing. There is a strong tradition in the Scandinavian countries for personal individual autonomy, which is so highly valued that people appreciate the freedom from personal dependence in the family and in the neighborhood more strongly than depends upon some or some kind of mutual commitment, or you could call it dependency on care providers, for instance, representing the state or the municipality. That seemed to work well in a period where people could really achieve what they saw as the important values of individual autonomy within, for instance, local communities where they could influence the kinds of assistance that they needed from local carers and the municipality. But now it is a huge problem because the services are becoming poorer, and as you find isolated people in communities, for instance, or even in big cities, of course, it's becoming a serious problem with services that do not meet the demands. And there are no real alternatives, even though the voluntary sector are experimenting with ways of organizing voluntary work that maybe turn out to be a real contributor to this system, but we don't know yet. I don't. Yeah. Well, and the last thing I would just like to emphasize is that concerning the state, people in Scandinavia has not seen the state as very powerful because it hasn't been that powerful. It has been very much based on decentralization of power, but now the states are really getting stronger. That's a spooky picture because the world hasn't seen a very heavily centralized welfare state before. The Soviet Union collapsed, and we know why. So that scares me a lot. The state's power to define what welfare is and what kinds of resources are supposed to be established to make it possible. That doesn't work, would be my hypothesis.
Thanks. I see time is running really fast, so I think we should wrap it up. But Hanne, you had also
I just have a small comment on the technology issues. And I think Lisa, on one hand, is right in pointing out that there are various kinds of technologies, and some might be very useful. But what we see from recent studies in Denmark on nursing homes and for instance, intelligent floors, is that what they create is actually an intensification of work. It creates more care because care workers are interrupted in what they're doing by people who then touch the floor, because these intelligence floor actually react when elderly people get out of bed, which they're supposed to. But it creates more work because then they used to do rounds in the nursing homes. Now they do the rounds, but then on top of that, they all have all these alarms and bells ringing that are causing more care work, but also simultaneous more interruptions of the care going on. So I'm not so optimistic about technologies as actually saving us, so to speak. I think it's very ambiguous, and it also depends on what is being used and how it's being used, or maybe it shouldn't be used. I mean, we also had a failure a couple of years ago where in Denmark, in nursing homes, we tried to implement washing assembly belts imported from Japan so that we could speed up the washing and cleaning of elderly people. according to, that didn't work out at all. But that was a technology that came from a different context, which was supposed to be really useful, but which all of us are thinking today, how could they at all get that idea of putting people into a machine and then they could be watched? I mean, terrible nonsense. But this is just to say, you know, some people have good ideas, but when they meet the, you know, elderly, fragile people and the care sector, then it's not such a good idea. So it's just to say, you know, it's not so simple that technology is going to save us. Thank you.
Thank you. I see we have a couple of questions also from the online, but we should finish, right? Yeah. Or do we have? Okay, then if we have 10 minutes, then we will have the next question. So we are back to maybe the recruitment and the working conditions for the care workforce. So would a higher salary increase a nurse's desire to continue in their work? I guess this is for you, maybe. No. What would you say? A higher salary to care workers? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, of course, that's a good idea because the salary is not good. If you compare to engineers, for example, who has exactly the same amount of education. So, of course, yes, but it's not enough. No. We need to improve the working conditions, and we need more people with competence. So the people who have responsibility don't feel that they have to, they're being stretched in all the ways. So we need better salary. We need politicians who really understand the problem and are willing to finance an increase in number of nurses, nursing assistants, and other healthcare workers. Yeah, so we need a really political revolution, I think.
Yeah. Better politicians of. Oh. Okay, I will have the next one here. I'm interested in the question of racialization of the care workforce in Norway and the Nordics. And I wonder if you can say something about the insertion into the care economy in this part of the world. Is it characterized primarily by precarity and more informalization, even when they work in the formal sector? And what is their relationship with the welfare state in terms of trust and belongingness, which I assume will impact on their ability to craft a sense of well-being, belongingness, and agency in relations to their relationship with the larger Norwegian society? So the racialization of the care workforce in Norway and the Nordics. Yeah.
There are, for instance, then what we mean when we are talking about the racialization process among care workers is that instead of increasing the salaries for local nurses, for instance, we open up for an immigration of nurses, for instance, from Spain that come for a temporary period, like for instance 3 months or 4 months, and they are kind of recruited by commercial agencies, and they come to Norway because they are better paid in Norway than, for instance, in Spain. So they are cheaper and they don't accumulate welfare benefits since they are not hired by the nursing homes, and they are hired by the commercial agencies, and they come from Spain. That's the kind of the internal EU migration. But we also have nurses coming from Sweden and from Finland, because nurses are better paid in Norway than in Sweden and Finland. And there have been, last year was strikes going on among Finnish nurses, and there are also been strikes going on among Swedish nurses. So there are differences between the Nordic welfare states. When it comes to informal migrant care workers, we have, for instance, the case that people coming with nurses education from other countries, like for instance from Lithuania or from Poland, they are not necessarily get the correct credits for the nurse education. So they had to work as nurse assistants for a number of years because before they get their nurses education accepted, which means that, for instance, a nursing home, a local or a national nursing home, can actually get access to professional nurse work, but pay less than it is valued for instance. But according to Spanish nurses, they prefer to work in Norway. So this is also kind of, they think that they get better pay, they get the welfare benefits. And but the problem is, of course, that if you see it in a kind of a global care chain perspectives, we also have to ask, what kind of care issues do they leave at home? What kind of care issues do they cause in, for instance, in Lithuania? Who takes care of their children? Who takes care of their grandmothers and grandfathers while they are doing care in for instance, a Scandinavian nursing home? So having a kind of a global perspective on these issues makes it visible that it's not that easy to solve kind of local care deficits by opening for import of nurses or care workers. So it is kind of a much more complex and difficult issues than that the import solve the thing. But the positive thing is that, for instance, the nurses, the trade union, for instance, they open up, they have been very good in taking care of migrant nurses coming to Norway. They have been working consciously to take care of them, looking into that they have the salary, that they are paid according to local rules and so on. So this is also an important issue, that the trade unions have been very actively involved in the import of migrant care workers. Also, when it comes to au pairs, for instance, the Norwegian trade unions was involved in the au pair issues, and they have been very actively engaged to cancel their au pair agreement because it was misused as a kind of a domestic workers agreement instead of being cultural exchange. So I think this is also a part of what once was the Helga Hernes way of thinking about welfare states, that you have actively involved institutions like, for instance, trade unions, like also voluntary organizations that migrants have organized themselves. So, so of course there are issues, but there are also positive aspects of it, like, for instance, the trade unions' engagement in those issues.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, so I will. We are going to finish, and I will try to wrap up with a very brief summary. So I thank you again for your papers, and I think together the four of you have touched upon care as existential, as pointing towards a human interdependency, but maybe also in the form of having something to do with democracy or the basic fundaments of our society. And you also have pointed and talked in various ways about care as political, care as embedded in the division of labor, perhaps in the society, in the welfare state. You have talked about care as work and labor and as precarious labor, and you have tied it to class, something I think also was very interesting. In different ways you have done so. I wanted to run by you because there is an anthropologist whose name is Janet Reutemann. She's written a book from 2014 that is called Anti-Crisis, but we don't have time. Maybe we can discuss this afterwards, but what is happening when we as a researcher use and maybe invoke the concept of crisis? What do we actually do when we do so? Maybe something that Lise said, referring to Kari Martensen, we need a new language or we need new metaphors. Maybe that's also something interesting to just think about when we move on from here. But again, I want to thank you for coming to Bergen and contribute to this seminar. And I hope we can continue these discussions. So thank you. And thank you to the audience as well.